You're listening to Atlanta Baseball Talk, your weekly podcast for all things Atlanta Braves.
Welcome to show number 325. Today is Monday, February 29th, 2016, and my name is Steve. No Hammy tonight, but I'm joined by Curtis. And Kurt, in tonight's show, we'll discuss Freddie's wrist, Frenchie's return, and potential starting rotations. But first, we are very happy to be joined by J.J. Cooper, managing editor at Baseball America, to talk about the Braves farm system. J.J., welcome back to the show. How are you?
Good. How are you guys doing?
Yeah, doing great. So, J.J., when we spoke to you last year, it was February last year, the Braves were essentially halfway through the remaking of their farm system. So we'll get to specific guys in a minute. But what's your general opinion of what they've done and how they've gone about it?
Well, at this time last year, it was, as you said, it was in the early stages. It was, let's acquire as many high-ceiling guys. Hey, if it's risky, that's okay. We'll spread our risk and try to kind of alleviate some of the risk by volume. And if you look at it now, still a lot of high risk, obviously, but at the same time, they have leavened it with a little bit of, I mean, some of those guys have reached the big leagues, but also they've leavened it with a couple of guys, a couple of moves that really bring in Dansby Swanson. Everything to me started to make a whole lot more sense when they made the Dansby Swanson move. Before that, there was a legitimate question of, okay, I see where they're going pitching-wise. I see that they are trying to build the Braves approach of the 90s where if you have enough arms, a lot of good things will happen. But it really was a lot tougher when you looked at the lineup to say, okay, so how is this lineup going to piece together? And you don't want to say that one guy changes all that, but in some ways adding Dansby Swanson does change a lot of that because that is the kind of cornerstone franchise position player that was lacking. And I think that makes a pretty dramatic difference for the organization going forward.
You know, it may be unfair because the acquisition of Swanson changed everything in terms of outlook as we were concerned, too, because we were, we'll get to the Simmons trade, but the Simmons trade really depressed us. It seemed like he's someone you build around. And then the Swanson acquisition happens, but I have to believe they kind of lucked into that. Like they didn't know they were going to get the future shortstop. They
can't. Yeah, you can hope, you can think. Yeah. We don't know. Like when the first conversation may have, maybe there had been a little seed planted or something. But no, you don't know that for sure. At the same time, maybe, if not, maybe it's not they get the shortstop, maybe it's they get the center fielder, maybe it's they get the third baseman, maybe it's done another way, but it's hard to find a guy who fits better what they needed than, I know that obviously they have Ozzy Albies as well, but still, it's really hard to find a way that fits better what they needed than that Dansby Swanson trade.
Well, and obviously that's the big guy. Are there any things that, I mean, he's got all the intangibles. He's supposed to be Derek Jeter, all these things. Are there any like things that we should be concerned about with him?
The concern really with him is that he may end up just being a very solid shortstop. That's not a bad thing. This was not considered an all-time draft. I mean, this is not, Dansby Swanson is not when Bryce Harper was sitting there at 1-1. He's not that. Again, I've seen the Derek Jeter comparisons, but to be honest, that's, to me, that I think, I don't really buy into that too much. For one, obviously, Jeter is, for whatever people think of it, I know that there are very mixed opinions on defense, but Jeter is an all-timer. I'm not ready to go that for Swanson yet. Swanson's been very good wherever he's been. He has a lot of athleticism. He is. I think that the risk with him is that he will be a very well-rounded shortstop who you say, okay, he's not Carlos Correa, he's not Corey Seager, he's not that kind of guy. He's more of a an occasional all-star than a perennial all-star. I mean, that's, maybe he ends up, if he really underachieves what, expectations, he ends up being a useful starter for a number of years. Again, I think the floor for him is really pretty high. I would expect him to move pretty quickly. I would be surprised if we end up finding that he's not a true big league shortstop. I would be surprised if he doesn't hit somewhat. Now, again, the other thing is that Will Fuller has a more significant concern. He has struck out more often than you would in college than you would like for a guy kind of his profile, of his pedigree. It's not a absolute, flashing red light or anything like that, but he does have some, he does pile up some strikeouts, and you can have some concern with that because the reality is that a lot of the best college players don't strike out at that rate. But again, that's quibbling on a guy who really is very well rounded, should have very few significant weaknesses as a future big league shortstop.
All right, JJ, let's stay in the middle of the infield and talk about Ozzie Albies. Should the fans be happy to have him over Jose Peraza in the farm system?
Yeah, but at the same time, I don't think they're dramatically different. Albies is younger. I think Albies has a little bit better hit tool. I think Albies has a chance to walk a little bit more to go with his contact ability. At the same time, if you have a concern with Ozzie Albies, now Jose Altuve has shown you can be a short second baseman, short middle infielder, and be very good. But Ozzie Albies, you do have concerns about, okay, the same questions that were raised with Jose Peraza, will he impact the baseball? You can fairly raise some of those same questions with Albies. He is small, and he's going to be small. He's not, particularly weak for his size, but he's not going to be, obviously, a power hitter at any point. He's very unlikely. And when you talk about, I know he's listed, I would say he's, having seen him in person, I think he's shorter than his listed height. There aren't a whole lot of really long-term big league shortstops, more second baseman, but big league shortstops at his height. Jimmy Rollins is the guy that jumps out. But he is a little shorter than your typical shortstop. So those are the concerns. I mean, again, we're talking about a guy who has excellent hand-eye, excellent bat to ball, and should have significant defensive value as well. I do think it's more likely that he moves to second than Swanson. I think Swanson's probably the long-term shortstop. But, no, I think, he's younger. He hasn't been moved off shortstop. I mean, I think there's less questions about him playing shortstop than Jose Peraza. But I also don't think that Albies is in a completely different class than Jose Peraza either.
Well, and of course we talk Jose Peraza, which leads us to Hector Olivera. You guys have him third in the Braves organization and 55th overall in baseball, but it seems like some of his numbers in winter ball, which was cut pretty short, we're starting
disappointing.
Kind of starting to lose confidence in him. So should we believe your ranking, or is he still considered such a high-level prospect?
Again, I will say this. There is no one out there, I really think that knows Cuban baseball in the U.S. better than Ben Badler, who does our Cuba stuff for us. Ben talks to everyone down, who covers, who scouts Cuban baseball. He watches literally hundreds of Cuban baseball games a year. And he is convicted in Hector Olivera's bat. Last year, obviously, was not good. There was a lot of injury issues there. Obviously, the age is. I have concerns because the real question is how long can he be an impact guy? The Braves are obviously convicted, and I would say, it was not a great winter ball at the same time. I don't really put a whole lot of stock in, especially short stints in winter ball. It's just not long enough, really to be a great sample. We're going to know a lot. We're going to know a lot in the next 2-3 months. If Hector Olivera isn't in the lineup to start the season, that would be a glaring concern. I would expect he will be. The Braves are obviously convicted in some way to that. They wanted him when he was coming out of Cuba, when he was able to be signed. They paid a significant price, maybe a little less price than a lot of people think, because I think there are some questions, concerns about, Alex Wood's ability to kind of maintain his stuff with that delivery, with that, over the long term. But they paid a hefty price, and I do think that there is at least a solid shot that he is going to be a very productive big league regular this year. Now, how long is he going to be able to maintain that? He's already in the years where you say, okay, it starts going down, not up. So that's a concern. But I do think, I'll put it this way, if the Braves are if this rebuilding process is going to arrive halfway in 17 and then full bore in 18, Hector Olivera needs to be part of that for the Braves. Because, again, as you guys know, there are less bats, especially less bats who will be in the big leagues in 17 and 18 than there are pitchers in the farm system. And they need Olivera to be a significant part of this lineup, because the lineup has still got a number of significant holes to it, and that's really you kind of have to think also kind of along those lines. That's where the Swanson move is so big, but there's still got to be more to do on the on the position player side, much more than on the pitching side. You look at it right now and say, again, I know Austin Riley had a great debut. I know the Braves are very high on Austin Riley. Austin Riley's going to take a little while. Austin Riley will make his full season debut in 2016. He's not a guy who's going to be around in 2017, I would think, or anything like that. Position player-wise, there's guys, Malik Smith, I like Malik Smith, but Malik Smith is not the guy you're going to build your lineup around. You hope he's a productive member of that lineup. Guys like that, there just still are not a whole lot of guys. Swanson should be up in, at late 16 or 17, I think. But beyond that, you say guys are going to be middle of the lineup or top of the lineup guys versus bottom of the lineup guys, there's still some work to do.
The talk last year, JJ, was that Rio Ruiz was possibly third baseman of the future. I'm not really banking a lot on Adonis Garcia. Is Ruiz going to make an impact, do you think?
I think there's a chance. I would say it's less, I would say it's 50-50 at best. Ruiz has some athleticism. He's gotten better at third base. I think really the question is he ever going to really be an impact hitter? And I think there still are some concerns about that. Now, Austin Riley, I guess the concerns are, I think Austin Riley has a better shot of being an impact bat than Ruiz. At the same time, I think Ruiz probably has a little bit better shot of being a solid defensive third baseman than Riley. So, there are still a number of scouts who think that Riley may end up moving across the diamond or somewhere else at some point. So there are still some concerns there. Third base is one of the positions that you look at. Well, the good thing again for them is that they have a couple of guys to choose from. Hopefully, if you're the Braves, but
right.
But I think Ruiz. I'll put this way: going into 2016, I think he still definitely has some significant things to prove. He's shown some flashes, but there's still stuff to prove there, and I don't think he's shown enough that the Braves can feel confident, oh yeah, that's definitely our third baseman of the future.
So let's move on to some pitchers, JJ, and Sean Newcomb and Aaron Blair are sort of at the top of the heap right now. What do you love about them? What concerns you about those two guys?
I like how those are kind of the yin and yang. Sean Newcomb is the guy who, if it all comes together right, he is the horse at the front of the rotation. That's him. He misses bats. Giant. Again, he's the guy who has the body that just looks like it oozes durability, but really, really significant stuff. It all comes down to, is he going to throw, he has at times had solid control, or at least the flashes of having potentially solid control. But overall, for his career, and obviously his college career was not something, this is not a guy who pitched 3 years at LSU or anything like that, but you look at him and say he's got to throw more strikes more consistently than he has so far. That being said, it's truly frontline stuff. Again, if, the key being if, that he throws more strikes. Aaron Blair, I don't think Aaron Blair has nearly the ceiling that Sean Newcomb does. At the same time, much safer. You look at him and say, this is a guy who should be pretty quickly a solid mid or number 3. I think is a hope. Number 4 is maybe a little more realistic, but somewhere in that range, a guy who fits in the middle to slightly the back end of a rotation and does it and is pretty durable, pretty reliable doing that. So, again, that's a nice 1-2 combo when you have this guy two guys who've got upper-level minor league experience already, one of whom has exceptional stuff, and another one who really knows how to pitch and has solid stuff to where you say, this guy can help pretty soon.
Well, do you make the trade? I mean, is Newcomb a guy that you would have given Simmons up for?
Considering what the Braves are trying to do, the sense I get is, and again, they even can't really come out and say this, but the sense I get in conversations I've had is that they have a belief, maybe a little strong, but a concern that since defense peaks earliest, it peaks earlier than the bat, that we may have already seen the best of Anderson Simmons. Again, I don't think you'll ever get anyone to say that publicly, but I get that sense from kind of conversations I've had with guys and all. And if that's the case, yeah, I can see why you do it, because you say, look, the best of Anderson Simmons is something we've had, and reality is the best of Anderson Simmons in 2016 is not going to do anything for Atlanta either. The best of Anderson Simmons in 2017 might be a little worse than the best of Anderson Simmons in 2015-16. Again, obviously you can look at it an entirely different way and say, you've seen pieces that Anderson Simmons could be better than this, because if the defense stays the same and the offense, he puts a little combination of what he's shown flashes of together, he's even better than he was in, say, 2015. But if you're doing that, I can see why you would say, okay, Newcomb is, to be honest, that he's the best. He is the best pitching prospect that they've acquired in these trades. I'm scanning through my head to make sure I'm not forgetting someone. But if you're comparing him to a guy like Fulton-Awitz, comparing him to Aaron Blair, you're comparing him to Touki Toussaint, has every bit the ceiling of Sean Newcomb, but Touki Toussaint's a lot further away. And I would say that the likelihood of Newcomb coming close to his ceiling is higher than Toussaint. So you put that all together, and yeah, they paid a high price. But, I mean, I understand. I think a lot of the reaction that came from Braves fans on that was understandable, which is that if you're a Braves fan, you've got to watch this team. You had to watch this team in 15. You're going to have to watch this team in 16 because you're a Braves fan. And the 2016 team got a whole lot less interesting when you take away a guy who makes a play a week that makes it worth going to the ballpark, or makes it worth tuning in and watching the game. The team got a lot less interesting. In the long term, I can see the logic of why they would do that. Again, they very well could lose that trade. That is a high-risk trade for them. But it is that Sean Newcomb was the number one prospect as we saw it in their system before they acquired Swanson. So they got a significant guy in return, but obviously they paid a price to do that too.
So, JJ, the one guy in the last wave of pitching prospects from last year was Max Fried. Mm-hmm. How high a ceiling? How do you compare him to Jenkins and Toussaint and Fulton-Awitz? Max
Fried's been a better prospect than Tyrell Jenkins. Nothing against Tyrell Jenkins, but I mean, he's always been considered a notch above that. Tyrell Jenkins has had injury problems. Max Fried has had this significant, has had a Tommy John surgery here. Right. But I would say that, I would say Max Fried, again, provided that he proves that he's made it back from this, slots in a significant notch above Tyrell Jenkins. Now, again, Touki Toussaint, that's more of an interesting, they're very different. They're very different guys. But Tukey Toussaint is the guy who, I mean, what do you want? He's trying to put a percentage on it. I mean, you see Tukey Toussaint on the right night, and you're like, this guy is almost everything you're looking for. You see Tukey Toussaint on the wrong night, and you're like, what is, okay, yeah, he throws hard, but what is this? Mm. Max Fried is less high variance. Max Fried, again, take the injury issues out of it, is a guy who is a little bit more of your traditional. He was considered one of the best high school pitching prospects in his draft class. He was considered one of the better young high school draft pro prospects pre-injury. So really 16 is big because we just want to kind of see him get on the mound. I'll put it this way. Colby Allard, Max Fried, not a massive amount of difference as far as what they were considered as far as their prospect status, their ability coming out of high school. So, and that's to me kind of guys who fit kind of pretty well together in that they were, there wasn't a massive range of difference. Again, if you compare apples to apples, when you say where Allard was considered, really especially coming into a senior year of high school pre-back injury, and where Fried was considered coming into a senior year of high school.
Let me ask you, you're evaluating here, looking at what the Braves have been able to do, pulling all this young talent together. And of course, the big talk is that they're framing it after what the Royals did and what the Cubs did, what the Astros did, all these teams. Is this farm system now, is this comparable to what those other teams built before they went on their major league run? I mean, can we expect, I know it's impossible to tell, but I mean, is this comparable to what those other teams had?
Not yet, but then the key word on that is yet. The difference being, I mean, when you look at where the Cubs were really just a year ago, that was the Cubs who were riding the benefit of, they had just drafted Schwarber reasonably high after drafting Chris Bryant very high the year before. You look at the Royals, when we ranked the Royals as the first team to ever have 9 players in our top 100 prospects list. Well, where the Royals were there is after they had a chance to draft a draft where they drafted Moustakas and a draft where they drafted Hosmer and spent a ton of money elsewhere in those drafts, and in those same drafts that spent money to get John Lamb and Mike Montgomery, and they drafted Will Myers very high. So they had multiple picks very high. The Braves are going to pick very, very high this year. The Braves are going to spend a ton of money internationally this year. So, and really the reality of it is that the Braves are not going to graduate a whole lot of guys who are their top prospects in the farm system right now. So we did not rank them number 1. Right now in our talent rankings, we have them 3, but that's very good. They went from 29 to 3. If you look at from the start before they really kicked in the rebuilding last offseason, that's a pretty dramatic jump. But I would expect, if we're talking at this time next year, that the Braves are going to rank higher. They very well could be number 1 next year because, again, they should be adding. They're going to be adding a guy, the number 3 pick in this draft, and they're going to have a lot of money to spend in the draft. Well, that's going to add a significant. The number 3 player in a draft usually is a top 50 range prospect for us on the top, and this seems like a pretty solid draft. So, again, think of it this way: that's an Alex Bregman, Brendan Rodgers type. Both those guys were top 50 prospects for us this year.
Right.
Well, again, and that might repeat next year too. They might end up with a very high draft.
Right. And again, then I was going to say is that, and they're not going to be. I mean, this is a team that if they win 70 games this year, they had a pretty successful season as far as wins and losses. So they're going to draft high again next year. Well, you put those two together, and yeah, at that point when you're talking, okay, well, what does this team have for 2017, 2018? Well, yeah, that's where I think this team very well could be in that same situation. The tough thing is that, obviously there are no guarantees with this, and the Braves could end up having the best of that group because look at how many guys that we're talking about right now who could be significantly more highly regarded a year from now or less. Max Fried you just brought up. If Max Fried comes back and is healthy and is the same Max Fried we saw pre-injury, he goes from being off the top 100 to easily back on it. Tuki Toussaint. If Tuki Toussaint just throws, I'm not saying he walks 2 per 9 this year. I'm saying if Tuki Toussaint improves that to where he walks 4.5 per 9, and the fastball breaking ball combo is there, he's easy. It could be an easy top 100 guy next year. If Colby Allard shows that the back injury seems to be well behind him and it's no big issues, and he's the same Colby Allard that he was in high school, Colby Allard's another guy who's a top 100 guy. Again, Dansby Swanson. If Dansby Swanson goes out, who's really yet to play full season ball and doesn't end up exhausting his rookie eligibility, but Dansby Swanson, starts the season in A-ball, ends it in Double-A, and has a monster year. Well, Dansby Swanson is going to move up into being a top 10 prospect next year. You've got all these guys. I mean, again, and we could obviously keep going. If Austin Riley makes his full season debut and dominates, well, he's a top 100 guy. There's all these guys who we could point to and say they really and that I know that a lot of people may be listening to this and thinking, well, yeah, you can say that about any prospect, but really not in the same way. If we rewound this clock to a couple of years ago, we said, well, Jason Hurst wasn't going to be a top 10 prospect with the big season. That was probably outside of his realm of realistic, likely possibilities, much less probabilities. If we rewound and, we're talking about guys like that, they weren't as high ceiling. They weren't the same possibility because, again, a lot of these guys we're talking about, Tuki Toussaint, Max Fried, Colby Allard, were 3 of the better or best high school pitching prospects in their draft classes. Dansby Swanson, we didn't talk about Sean Newcomb. Sean Newcomb, who again may exhaust his eligibility this year, but if Sean Newcomb does the same stuff he did last year, but the control troubles he had, especially after he reached Double-A, are under control. Well, Sean Newcomb even is a much more significant prospect next year than he is this year. We can say this on a whole lot of guys in the Braves system, and that's where you look at this and say they really could be building something special here. The key word there is could be.
All right, JJ, let's end with this. So who in the farm system, give us one name, a guy that doesn't get a ton of pub, but you think could make a real impact on the major league level?
Scanning through. I mean, it's funny, before I kind of lead into that, like you mentioned, Adonis Garcia, it is crazy to me that he ended up being kind of a guy who's now probably penciled in as a regular, which, that's something I do think is also worth noting is that the Braves have done a pretty decent job of kind of finding guys along the periphery. Chase Peterson, who is a prospect, but that was a pretty solid pickup. I don't think he's going to be even necessarily an everyday regular, long term. I know he did that some last year, but he is a guy who you look at him and say this guy can have some value for the big league team for really, I'd say, for several years to come, especially right now with him being cheap. It depends on how deep we want to go. I'm a big Brady Feigl fan, and that's partly just he's a reliever. That's just kind of what he is. But I like Brady Feigl as a guy who everything, especially for a guy who was signed as a non-drafted free agent who had some injury issues and all. But I just look at him as a guy who I do think will have a relatively solid career for a while as a useful piece in the bullpen. Lucas Herbert, I think, could be a solid, a very solid, young catcher who could develop. I mean, those are two guys who, those are definitely not completely off the, out of the blue kind of guys, but those are both guys who don't get as much mention, who I'm kind of interested in. And that's on two very different extremes. Obviously, Lucas Herbert, if it all works out, is a regular, and Brady Feigel's a useful reliever. But I kind of have my soft spot for useful relievers sometimes.
All right, everyone, you can read JJ's work at baseballamerica.com and follow him on Twitter at JJCoop36. JJ, thanks for your time. This was great. We look forward to talking to you again.
Hey, can I ask you one question? I want to ask you one question to wrap up, because you talked about it. As Braves fans, what has it been like with this? I've watched it so far. I grew up in Georgia, so I mean, the Braves were my team growing up as a kid. Dale Murphy, Chris Chambliss, Claudell Washington, all those guys. Just Pocoroba and everyone. But I'm old. But having kind of endured this, I guess, for the word, is it cautious optimism? Is it frustration? How would you kind of term it?
So I would say that last year was pretty tough, and it got tougher as the season went on, as the losing started to happen at the major league level. The Simmons trade was a real gut punch. And then, we sort of talked about this, that Shelby Miller trade and the Swanson acquisition, it changed everything for me. It felt like that one piece made all the other pieces seem better and have more sort of potential, and it made the future seem brighter. So I was not particularly looking forward to last year. I'm really looking forward to this year because we're going to, there's going to be so many guys to watch in the minor leagues, and there's going to be some interesting guys to watch before the end of the season's over in the majors. I mean, we'll probably see Jenkins at some point and Aaron Blair at some point. And the Hector Olivera thing is so interesting because you talked about it. I mean, he's really a key. John Hart described him as sort of phase one in the offensive rebuild. And if he doesn't pan out, that's going to be a big blow to the position player sort of rebuild that's going on, which is obviously not gotten as much focus as the pitching. So last year was kind of, tough, but I'm looking forward to this year. I don't know, Kurt, you've lived in Atlanta all your life. So how has it been for you?
JJ, like you, I grew up and watched the team through the 80s when they were just impossible to watch. I guess
I think it was like the early 80s were like really enjoyable, and then you get to like 80. I remember a really good Pete Smith game in like 86 and thinking, wow, this is one of those rare days, because most of these days are just unwatchable.
Right. It was like all summed up when they signed Nick Asaski, and then he never plays because he has vertigo. So I guess I think that collectively we felt like they've gone and they've made the right decision going in this direction. It's just tough to watch a team go from 96 wins to whatever it was last year, 67 wins in just a couple of seasons. It seemed like they were so close, and we were so excited about that team. And then when they lost in the playoffs, all their problems seemed to be glaring, and then it was all gone. So I think people are trying to be patient about it and are excited about the possibility. But me being a cynical old Atlanta fan, and that's all sports, I figure that if there is a place for this to actually go wrong, as they keep telling us that everywhere they've done this, it's worked out well, it's going to be Atlanta. So,
and JJ, one other thing I'd add is, while I agreed with it, it was very difficult to see Hayward walk out the door. Of all those guys that they let go, even more so than Kimbrel in my mind, Hayward was the most painful.
Is it a fair way to put it that from a head standpoint, this all kind of makes sense, but from a heart standpoint, it's been really tough? Is that kind of what y'all are saying, or is that a little different than that?
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. From a heart standpoint, seeing Hayward go and seeing Kimbrel go, even seeing Gaddis go. I mean, I know that Gaddis was never sort of a long, but he was a real fan favorite. So yes, but my head sees the long-term picture, and it looks very bright. But yeah, it's been a very strange 18 months.
Yeah, and it coupled with them leaving Atlanta to go to the suburbs.
Yes, yeah.
Y'all may have seen, I tweeted this many a time, but there is a certain disappointment that I have that Andrew Jones could not hang around for one more year, because I really did want Andrew Jones to outlast Turner Field. I thought it would be insane for a player who played in the first game at Turner Field to still be playing when they went into a new stadium. But,
well, you never know. They brought Frenchie back, so maybe Andrew will.
Yeah,
he could jump in there.
Next year he goes back to playing. Yeah, unlikely, but it is a dream.
That's right. All right, JJ. Again, thanks so much. We really appreciate it, and we'll hopefully talk to you next year.
Sounds good. Thanks, Jeff.
Okay, thanks, JJ. So, Curtis, let's check in on some early storylines from spring training camp. So, I think we should start with Freddie's wrist. So, position players arrived last week, and the big news was that the team would be taking it slow with Freddie's wrist, and that he hadn't faced any live pitching since last season, and was only now gearing up with dry swings and hitting off the tee. Now, since then, he passed a big hurdle by taking live batting practice on February 27th, 2 days ago. So, Kurt, I wasn't spending much time earlier in February worried about Freddie and his wrist, but all this cautious behavior has made me really worried about Freddie. How about you?
I guess not as much. I mean, it seems like that they're just taking a cautious approach to him, knowing that there's no real reason to rush him back. So, no, I haven't been overly concerned. And it seems like the very early reports are that I think he took practice 3 days in a row or 3 days out of 4 or something and really didn't experience any pain. So those are all good signs to me that it's okay, and I'm not super worried about it.
Yeah, I mean, so he has passed every hurdle so far without any setbacks. There's, at least from what they've been saying, there's no, he expected to do this today, but he's not going to because of any discomfort or anything like that. Kevin McAlpin posted some good video footage of him taking more live BP today. And he looked good. He certainly didn't look to be holding back. He didn't seem to be favoring anything. But I just wasn't thinking about the wrist being potentially, this fragile or worrisome. And maybe you're right. They're just being prudent about it. But, God, it would really be terrible if, the first month something goes down.
Yeah, I don't know that the backup options are really I guess Kelly Johnson is the primary backup option, and Swisher. Yeah. Assuming Swisher is still around.
Right, yes. And we'll get to that in a minute, actually. But okay, so signs, everything's good so far, but for the record, I'm worried.
For the record, I'm not yet.
Okay. So, Kurt, in a surprise move, the Braves signed Jeff Francoeur to a minor league deal, including an invite to camp. This all went down last week, and when they talked about him afterward, he said he had no idea this was coming. It all came together very quickly. He ended up speaking with John Hart and John Scherholtz, and a day later it was done. So, nostalgia, all that stuff. You excited about Frenchie back in camp?
Oh, yeah. I mean, the nostalgia aspect, certainly. But, it's not like he wasn't relatively decent last year. I mean,
yeah, he had a pretty decent numbers last year,
and his pinch hitting even more so. So, if he had played for the Braves last year and put up his numbers, he would have had the second highest home runs and the second highest slugging percentage on the team amongst players with 300 or more at bats. So, and he batted, I forget what he batted, but it was like 300 something as a pinch hitter, had 11 RBIs as a pinch hitter, which was at the top of the Major League Baseball numbers. So he still, I assume I didn't get to see him play much defense, but I assume he's probably a still decent defensive player.
Yeah,
Hector Olivera is not, Nick Swisher is not. So, I honestly, if it was all about the money, I would think that Jeff Francoeur had a much, much better chance of making the team than Nick Swisher or Michael Bourne did. But because they're owed so much money, they obviously have the leg up in that competition. But yeah, and we talked to Derek Schiller and we kind of joked about what their angle was going to be for the year. It's clearly nostalgia. Andrew Jones back
today, right?
Tim Hudson is in camp, helping out.
We'll get back to Frenchie in a second. The Andrew Jones thing is great because he's going to be working. He's not only working with the outfielders, but he's also going to be part of sort of the international scouting. It's fantastic, I think.
Sure.
Yeah.
And now all they need is for McCann to get released by the Yankees, and maybe they can bring him back over too.
And don't forget Blaine Boyer.
That's right.
The quotes you hear about Frenchie are not only, we're excited about what he can bring on the field, which is probably somewhat spin, but there's also a lot of, we're excited what he could bring off the field, in the clubhouse. Obviously, a guy like Frenchie local guy, top prospect. Him hanging around Dansby Swanson this spring has got to be a positive thing. The part that I don't get, Kurt, is like a lot of moving parts are going to need to move for there to be a spot for Francoeur. And you mentioned the money, right? So you've got Swisher, who's owed $15 million this year, and Bourne, who's owed $14 million this year. Now I know that part of the deal was $10 million goes from Cleveland to the Braves to cover that, but $10 million of the 29. So there's big money owed to those guys. Freddie Gonzalez last week was talking about how loves Bourne, sees him as part of the team. So early indications are that they're looking to keep Bourne, so then they're trying to trade Swisher. They have to be thrilled that Swisher showed up to camp without his knee brace for the first time in like 2 years.
And that he was totally stoked, bro.
Well, that part wasn't a surprise. So you've got those two guys, right? You've got Kelly Johnson, who can play outfield.
Emilio Bonifacio, who I totally forgotten about.
You've got, Bonifacio's getting $2 million. Kelly's getting $2 million. I had this written down. I forgot my notes. Kelly's getting $2 million. I think Bonifacio's getting like $1.2 million. There's a lot of bench outfielders. I'm not sure. I mean, if you move Swisher, I guess maybe that makes room for Francoeur, but it still seems like you have a ton of pieces you can put in the outfield without signing Jeff Francoeur. I like the fact that he's back. I always liked Francoeur. It would be neat if he ended up on the bench, but it seems like sort of low probability.
Yeah, it really does. And I mean, I guess the other thing is, I mean, it seems like Bonifacio, they've sort of got that guy now. So,
right, both Bonifacio and Johnson can play infield and outfield.
Right.
You get a lot of flexibility with those guys that, frankly, you don't get with Francoeur. I mean, Francoeur's an outfielder and a right fielder, really, right? You're not putting him in center. You could put him in left.
Yeah, he played some left last year for the Phillies,
yeah.
So... but yeah, I mean, they talked, and I read something today, and they're like, yeah, it's not really a consideration that he would play any first.
Right. Because, again, you've got Swisher who can play first. You've got Kelly Johnson who can play first. There's really ample backups there, and to start anew with Francoeur playing first doesn't make a lot of sense.
Sure.
All right, so, Curtis, today there was talk of the starting five. Freddie Gonzalez came out and said he had an initial idea of what that starting five would look like, and he named Tehran, Bud Norris, Matt Whistler. No surprise there. But the back end, he mentioned Kyle Kendrick and Yolis Chassin, or Julius Chakin, as I prefer. So Freddie actually had this quote about those five. He said, quote, "We're going to build those guys up as starters, get them stretched out and prepared to go north. They're going to be the main five guys." Now, the weird thing, I was looking at other articles tonight, and there's a lot of other articles that Freddie's like, yeah, the competition's wide open, and we want to see what guys like Blair can do and Tyrell Jenkins. And so I know that you texted Ham and I this morning about this, Kurt, and you're like, really? We're not going to, have any of the young guys at the back end of the rotation, let alone Williams Perez and Banuelos and Folty coming up, a couple weeks behind everybody else. So what are your initial thoughts on this? Is Freddie just, talking beginning of spring training stuff?
Yeah, I guess that's my initial reaction. I mean, I think I joked about Wandy Rodriguez and that he probably was mentioned in the same breath that these guys are now, before last spring training. And things will change. I guess the thing that I thought about more as we were just discussing this earlier offline is that all those guys you just mentioned are coming back from injuries in one way or the other. So maybe they want to start with these guys and let those guys, make sure those guys are completely healed up and ready to go before they put the expectation of starting the season. Maybe it's a way to save their arms and not, give them a full season of innings. I don't know. It just seems strange. I mean, the whole thing is about youth and getting these guys experience, and then we're going to see some guys that, have kind of been around the block. Now, I think we all think that Bud Norris could be a steal, that Yashin could be a steal, and that these guys might actually be able to pitch for us. And maybe that's what they're counting on, is that they can have some stability coming out of spring training with these guys, and not have just a crazy young team, crazy young starting rotation.
Getting crushed out of the gate.
Right. And just let these guys pitch for a while. And if one of these guys goes down, or if they're terrible, like whatever the dude's name was who we always forget that they released last year, the two guys, I should say, that, then they could bring in one of the guys that Williams Perez or Banuelos or somebody like that and have them ready to go. And, of course, Fulte is probably not going to be ready to go at the beginning of the season anyway.
Right. Yeah, when we spoke to Copy, and again today on Twitter, Copy was answering questions on Twitter today, he mentioned Blair and Jenkins as possibilities being seen on the team this year, on the big club, that is. So maybe you're right. I mean, maybe this really is all about let those guys get a little more seasoning in AAA, but we know that, well, the thinking could be when we trade Kyle Kendrick and Chacin at the trade deadline, we bring these guys up. Or it's just a lot of that sort of idle chatter that goes on the first week of camp, where half the news stories are so-and-so really impressed in his bullpen session.
Right.
And, it's possible that just sort of fueled Freddie's comments. Although it is weird, the very sort of specific, sounds like there's a lot of intent in, we're going to build those guys up as starters. They're going to be the main five guys.
Well, and what would your take be on if they come out and, I mean, I guess I'm ready for the youth. I don't want them to get pounded, and I don't want them, to lose their major league confidence or something like that. But, right. I mean, if they come out of spring training and they're, in fact, a really old team, because they've got a bunch of old guys on this team. I mean, it's a mix right now, but I mean, if you think of all this kind of Kelly Johnson and Brzezinski and Jim Johnson and Jason Grilli and, some of these other guys that they brought in, like we just mentioned.
Bourne and Swisher and
Ogando and all these sorts of players that they've kind of brought in to certainly add experience to the roster. But I mean, I think I'd be a little disappointed if they trot out this really kind of old team that's still not going to be any good. I would rather see young guys playing and getting the taste of it, and maybe even finding out if they're major league ready as we go into the phase of moving into the new stadium and whatnot, as opposed to watching Kyle Kendrick be relieved by Ogando.
Well, I think there's no way that the entire season plays out, Kurt, and we don't see Blair at some point. We don't see Jenkins at some point. Newcomb may not be ready. We will see Fulte.
Malix and guys like that.
Yeah, Malix, I guess. Boy, the Malix thing is going to be interesting, especially with the logjam in the outfield. And I don't quite believe the Braves really want to put Hector back at third thing as well. Andrew had some very nice things to say about Malix today, too, by the way. He called him very, very smooth. High praise from Andrew Jones.
Sure. I'm still totally stressed about Hector Olivera. Sorry.
Yeah. No, Olivera is going to be a huge key. I mean, if he actually is, if he's actually a decent offensive piece, it's a huge sort of leg up on the rebuild.
If he's terrible, it's kind of a big shot.
Well, yeah, it's certainly losing Alex Wood over him was not great. So we'll see. I mean, I wouldn't be shocked if the back end is Kendrick and Chacin, but I would like at least one of the. I'd like one of the kids, or Banuelos or Perez. I mean, there's really it's amazing how many pitchers there are. Yeah. But it would be weird.
Well, and who was the other guy? The kind of the little guy that they brought up at the end of the season who
Ryan
pitched
Weber.
really well.
Ryan Weber. Yeah, is that who you're thinking of?
Ryan Weber, right? Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, he's going to be in the mix, too. It will be interesting. All right, Curtis, that is the show. Everyone, please make sure that you're subscribed to our YouTube channel as well as on iTunes and Stitcher so that you don't miss any of our shows. We will get back to being weekly sometime in March. Until then, check us out at AtlantaBaseballTalk.com for past shows, to check out our blogs, and to post in our comments section. And be sure to follow us on Twitter at ATL Baseball Talk and to like us on Facebook. Thanks again for listening, everyone, and go Braves!
Thanks for listening to Atlanta Baseball Talk, your weekly podcast for all things Atlanta Braves. To find new shows, to post in our forum, or to send a comment, please visit us at AtlantaBaseballTalk.com.
Had to admit